Thank you, Shirley. My name is James. I do know some of you. I just wanted to, my credentials. First off, I you can tell from my accent, I clearly am an American. I probably split half my life. I lived my first half of my life in the States and the second half here in Australia. And I grew up in if you're familiar with America, I grew up in a cold northern city, Detroit, a big manufacturing center in the state of Michigan. And as I've always been fascinated by American politics, and I was very keen hobby of mine. And sort of in midlife, I had a bit of a change of life and changed my careers, and went and studied political science at University of Queensland, and I became a political scientist for a time. And I worked at the University of Melbourne. I was deputy editor of a site that covered elections around the world. And I acted effectively as the university's American politics expert. And for about 5 years or so, about from 2015 to 2020, I appeared regularly on ABC News, Sky News, appeared in print occasionally, radio. You might have seen me normally during the day, but I made it a couple of times onto the primetime shows. I got onto Planet America, 7:30 Report, and so on. So that was good. That was good fun. I thought we would start. I guess I find Australians are always fascinated by American politics. I get asked this, people hear my accent, they ask it all the time, whether it's at the checkout of the grocery store, or anywhere I happen to be. And this year in particular, it has been really quite intense. But I think there's always a challenge in that when our media reports on American politics, they just really sort of tell you what happened today, right? And they naturally use American terms that don't necessarily translate here. We hear about so-and-so winning a primary, and we hear about a piece of legislation being blocked by a filibuster. And then we hear about, so-and-so many votes in the Electoral College. And these are things that they're really hard without, it's content without context is how I think of it. And I was hoping to start today with probably, I'm aiming for about 15 or 20 minutes of just some background. So I'm a bit old school. It's going to be some PowerPoint slides. It's going to help me guide me as I go through. And there's just some sort of key essential facts I'd like you to know about America's political system, and then highlight those differences with the Australian political system in the hope that it sort of creates for the rest of for the question and discussion session, which I hope you have lots of, and I think there should be a lot of interesting ones to go over. We'll have a shared vocabulary and a shared knowledge base that we can work from. And I imagine you may have, I'm going to ask your indulgence to let me just go through that without breaking, but then heaps of time afterwards, hopefully, to go over the fascinating election and everything that's going on right now.
All right, just to let everybody know, just so we don't get any background noise, I've put everybody on mute. So if you need to ask a question, please unmute yourself. Thank you. And for those that have arrived late, we are recording this session. So please put your thumbs up if you're okay to be recorded. Thank you. Back to you, James.
Thank you. Is that looking good, Shirley? Right, we're all
good? Looks beautiful.
All right. Well, I really like that graphic. Our Tanner did that for me, and I think it looks terrific. So, okay. All right. So just a scene setter. What's at stake? So we know Election Day is Tuesday, the 5th of November. And of course, from our perspective as a country and an ally of America is, of course, the president. The president has a great deal of power when it comes to foreign affairs and defense, and that's normally where we as Australians would care about that. By the way, I will use we and our backwards and forwards as Americans and Australian. I feel like I've earned the right to have a foot in both camps. So sometimes my language, my pronouns will slip back and forth. So I apologize about that if it's confusing. But what you may not know is that American election days are stacked in that wherever you reside in America and that piece of land, whatever elections are that year, they're always held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So in fact, on that very day, when an American goes into a polling booth, first off, they'll be voting for the 4-year presidential term. That's the big the big event and why the turnout is always highest in presidential years. But on top of that, the entire lower house of the House of Representatives, which is the country divided into 435 districts, is also up for election. And they're up for election every 2 years. So in fact, that's what the midterm election is. So this is a presidential one, and then in 2 years, they'll do it again. 1/3 of the 100-seat Senate is up, and that's on a scheduled basis. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up. And not to mention 11 of the 50 state governorships are up. That's our equivalent of a premier. That's the majority of those are done in the mid-year, the off year, the 22 and 26, the non-presidential years, because it's hard to get traction and attention to a governor race when there's a presidential race on. But there's 11 of the 50, and there are 99 state legislatures spread across the 50 states, and 85 of them, all or portions of them, are up for election. And you can see, just look at how many that's 5,800 are up for election out of nearly 7,500 state legislatures. That's how big American politics are. That 50 states, roughly about 150 state legislatures. There are heaps of elections going on, and okay. Sorry. In addition to that, there was running out of room on the slide. There are state and county elections. Excuse me, city and county elections as well. It's a daunting task being an American voter. You are asked to do an awful lot, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. So I'm really going back here now. I promise this won't take long. You see in the background there, I got the guys with the powdered wigs and the silk stockings. So I'm trying to go back to the very basis of America's political system. And one thing that really helps to understand, even today, it's very relevant, is the American political system is old, really old. It was the Constitution was ratified in 1788, and that makes it the oldest active constitution in the world. And when you're trying to, I often did this with my students, when you're trying to explain something, you have to, and trying to make sense of it in a modern context, it doesn't make any sense. And look, it's tempting to sort of Americans are silly or weird, they just did this stupid thing. It's really not. It likely made sense at another time, at a very, very long time ago in this case. So it's a very old system, and trying to make sense of many of its elements in today's context is, well, you can't do it. It's a daunting task, and it doesn't make sense in today's context. Now, what the founding fathers who met for a constitutional convention they were given the task. There was a very short-lived system that America worked under called the Articles of Confederation for about 6 years. That was just each state just sent 2 representatives to a body, and they said, look, basically the 13 colonies, which became the 13 states, just said, hey, we're all independent. We don't need a federal government. Just, we'll send representatives to discuss various issues, to coordinate transport and tariffs, what have you. Well, they decided that system really broke down very quickly, and that there was no power of taxation, that it was very difficult to conduct foreign affairs. There was a minor uprising that occurred that the government had no way of responding to. So they said, okay, let's call a convention, and just, if you guys could just tweak the Articles of Confederation and just make them a little better, tighten them up, give us a chief executive, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they decided to take it upon themselves to rewrite the entire thing from the beginning. And the fact is, that was not what they were given to do, but they chose to take the summer in Philadelphia and spend it completely developing the American political system. And these are largely men from the British Isles. And so the model they had was the 3-tiered system that existed then in the United Kingdom. And it would have been, so the monarch, there's no hereditary titles in America. There's no landed gentry. They needed, like, how do we create this? We know we need a chief executive to conduct foreign affairs and possibly conduct wars. So they created an independently elected president gave them sort of some monarch-like powers, which is an ongoing problem to this day. Then the House of Commons would be mirrored in the House of Representatives, the lower house. This is the lower house of Parliament that does most of the bulk of the work. All spending bills have to be initiated in them. It's the most representative body, and that there's 435 of them currently. So at least it's the most granular level of representation at the federal level. And then similar to the House of Lords, they tried to create this upper house with far fewer members, just a couple per state, to try to sort of be sort of a house of oversight and sort of to cool the passions of what might come out of the House of Commons. So this is, again, they're doing the best they can with the system they have, and they didn't really have very many. They didn't have any large republics upon which to draw upon for their history. The main architect of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison, who went on to become the fourth president, he had to go back and he studied the Roman Republic, and he tried and he said, like, how do we create a system that's durable? Because at the time, much of the world, you were an empire or you were a city state, and there wasn't a lot in between. And so this was really kind of a pretty radical experiment for its time. And one more with the silk stockings and the powder wig. So this is an argument that is still going on to this day and is relevant in this year's election. And that, is America a complex and multicultural state? Is it a pluralistic democracy, or is it is it a bastion and a refuge for basically white Christianity from Europe? And that is kind of what the two parties are arguing over right now, is what sort of country do we have? And it's worth noting that history is very much on the side of the pluralistic side of that argument, and that first European settlement on the continental United States, was not Plymouth Rock, like they like to say about the Puritans arriving, which is the story around what is it, Thanksgiving and so forth. Actually, the first settlement in America was Spanish. The country was colonized by several European nations at the same time. Even Sweden, when I was doing some history on a class I was teaching, that Sweden had a golden age in the early 1600s, and it had an American colony. And even a symbol of America frontier mythology is the log cabin, right? The house made of rough-hewn logs, right? If you don't have proper timber processing. And it's sort of that image of like, that's kind of house that Abraham Lincoln grew up in, that sort of thing. It's part of our mythology. That structure came from the Swedes because it was a natural thing that they did in their homeland. But the reason why Britain became to dominate the North American colonies was the constant and multifaceted turmoil that was going on in the British Isles from the late 1500s, really up to the Act of Union in 1700, when they kind of created some peace in the British Isles. You had the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell's whatever he called himself, Lord Protector of the Realm or something. You had monarchists versus parliamentarians. You had the English versus the Gaelic peoples of Wales and Scotland and Ireland. And you even had the arguments of the Catholics and the Protestants. So you had a tremendous amount of turmoil during this time, and great acts of violence and pogroms and even attempted acts of genocide, like Cromwell did to the Irish, that drove whole families and even sometimes whole communities to resettle in North America. And that is unique amongst all the European countries that tried to colonize the North America. They were largely men who arrived. They were either soldiers of fortune, they were missionaries seeking souls and to rise up to the ranks of the church. They were generally men seeking fame and fortune. They were not families and communities. So, but because of the turmoil in the British Isles, the English populated it with women and families, and whole communities came, and therefore they just outpopulated all the other ones, and they dominated North America. And it's often a connection Americans don't make about the impact that the English Civil War and the turmoil in the British Isles had on America. But ultimately, that led to them just overpowering, just in terms of pure numbers, and why they eventually spread across the whole continent. And then lastly, the Atlantic slave trade began in 1619. So now we started importing Africans and the history of that. And there are African Americans who, if they were able to have, if there were administrative records available, trace their lineages back in America hundreds of years, much longer than many immigrants who came later on. Okay, so now a little bit of history, a little bit of space setting. I hope I haven't lost anybody. Now I have this note here that I realized I've only just looked at, and that is to slow down. So have I been talking too fast? How are we doing?
You're doing fine, James.
Am I okay?
Yes, thank you.
All
Now,
right.
reminder to everybody, you're on mute. So when
Too,
James does to question
too
and answer
bad.
time,
Good
please
question.
unmute yourself.
Terrific. Thanks. All right. Now, so I wanted to highlight the elements of the U.S. political system, particularly the ones that are different to Australia's system, so that we get a better, well, as I said, we have a better understanding of what goes on day to day. And one of the ones that the biggest distinction is, it is a directly elected chief executive, right, which we call the president, which has significant powers. And this goes back to that trying to sort of recreate what a monarch was did. Those men remembered that often when there was a threat to England, that it was very difficult to organize the lords, princes, particularly if the monarch was weak at a time. So they wanted to make sure they didn't get caught out with that. So they vested in the president quite significant powers, conduct foreign affairs, commander-in-chief of the military, gave them absolute pardon power, which is a real nightmare. It's unfettered, and it could pardon. And the idea was that, the judicial system could be unreliable and corrupt and so forth. And so you often wanted to have, say, a monarch who had a right to sort of correct those kind of wrongs, but wow, that kind of power, you would never give that kind of power to a chief executive now. And then this is the thing that a big part of the constitutional machinery that James Madison put in was, he actually wanted it to be difficult to do things. He staggered and split the electoral cycles, even on the same level of government. So at the federal level of government, you have a president on 4-year terms. We know all about that. Limited to 2 terms, which was informal for the longest time, and then became formal in the 1950s. Then you have the House of Representatives on 2-year terms, so half the cycle. And that is, by the way, this is unique amongst all democracies in the world. No one else has their lower house with a 2-year term. It is an insanely short period of time, makes it very hard to do policy. We find here, even in Australia, us on 3 years, there's only 3 or 4 countries that even have that short of a time. The vast majority are 4, and even a handful are 5 or 6. So that is a completely unique system that, again, may have made sense in 1788 in a way, but really you would never do that now. And then the upper house, the Senate, they serve 6-year terms, and then with 1/3 of them up every 2 years. So that means, you have people in the Senate right now. There's a third of the Senate that was elected nearly 6 years ago. So this was intentional to make it sticky and to make it difficult to do things. I think maybe Jefferson used the term, the Senate is where the sauce where the milk cools. Like they didn't want hot, passionate. They didn't want governments making passionate, impulsive policy. They wanted it to take time. And this can make the American system seem, well, can make it slow, and can actually make it ineffective at solving problems at times. In addition to the different power centers, the power centers don't even actually have their own unique powers. The powers are split across the various branches. And again, this was intentional. So the 2 houses of Congress need to pass a bill for it to become a law, but it doesn't become a law unless the president signs it, right? But then if the president refuses to sign it, called a veto, that's the word you might have heard bounced around, then both houses can overturn that with 2/3. So you see how the power is shared across these things, which makes cooperation. He was trying to create a system where cooperation and collaboration would lead to better policy and better outcomes. This was the idea, was that it would be really difficult for any faction to capture the government. Therefore, the factions, say in their world, the factions would have been, merchants and, well, landowners and small farmers. It wouldn't have been that complicated, but even still, to them, they said, we want the factions to work together to collaborate, and we will get better outcomes instead of any one faction grabbing hold of the government. The 3 branches are executive, legislative, and judicial. So this is so different from the Westminster system that we have here in Australia, where the executive and the legislative are always coordinated and always together, right? Because we take the prime minister and the cabinet from the party that controls the lower legislative house. So they're always aligned. They can't be blaming each other and saying, oh, we would be fixing that if it wasn't for those guys. You're one and the same. And it makes for a much cleaner decision-making process and a much cleaner way of keeping accountable. I'm just checking my time. I'm okay. Again, I'm doing okay. I'm going to speed up a little bit here. And this is my one political science nerd term that I included, and that is all of these things I just talked about create a status quo bias. That's a political science nerd term to say it's really hard to get stuff done. And it means that the status quo is it's like no change is what we prefer to. Now, this can become a real problem when you have lots of billionaires and lots of people with lots of power who might be perfectly happy with the way things are and are perfectly fine with the status quo, and they're willing to spend a lot of money to keep it that way. And that is an inherent problem they have. And it was designed to be a slow and sticky system. Now, I don't know if this was maybe a function of the time, but there's no proportional representation anywhere in the system, in that every office in America, from local dog catcher all the way to the president, is what's called first past the post. So you win it. That's it. The person with the most votes wins, and there's no room. Therefore, there's no room for minor parties or third parties to have any lasting impact. And so if having a situation where it's 45 to 35 to 20, I hope that math added up, may not have 35. There's no point in being the 20. You're out. You get nothing. If I ran a congressman in 435 houses, if they all in 435 districts, that they all got 20%, I would end up with bupkis. So it is a wasted effort, and therefore that means you have a two-party system in a massively complex country of 330 million people, and that means intra-party democracy. In other words, factions within a party that are competing for power and who sets the priorities when we win power, what's our messaging, what kind of personnel do we appoint, and so forth, is quite vibrant. And it takes a bit of time to even see that one. If anyone can remember the 2016 race of sort of Hillary versus Bernie, right? That Hillary would sort of represented sort of mainstream moderate establishment Democrats, and Bernie would have represented a left-wing, much more progressive side. And so those are two people within one party fighting for control of it, because we only have the two parties. There is no third party. There is no like lefty party that you can win any kind of power in, because of this lack of proportional representation. And I've already kind of said that point, is that because you divide this massive country into just two, parties can be really quite difficult to manage and unite. So you'll hear language about so-and-so is really uniting their party and their move forward. That is a real challenge. And it's a real challenge, by the way. The more complex your party is, in America's case, the Democrats are a party that look more like America. They're more multiracial, they're multi-religious, they're multilingual, and the Republicans are, and again, it's not all one, but it's about trends. And the Republicans are a much less complex party, and unity isn't quite the challenge for them as it is the Democrats. Now, at this point, I mentioned before, and I just want to reiterate, 4 layers of government in America, and these elections are stacked. Many directly elected positions you would never think you would be voted for, but often because of something in the past where corrupt governors were appointing their mates to judges or sheriffs or being the attorney general. So in many states, you actually elect positions that you would think would be a cabinet level officer. You often elect the attorney general, the secretary of agriculture, all these sorts of things. There are some states you elect judges. It's crazy how much you vote for. I'll never forget the first time I walked into a polling booth. It was a big tabulating machine, and it looked like an airplane cockpit. There were over 50 things that I had to pick. Judge, Americans are asked to do so much, and in addition, they're even asked to pick the nominees of their parties beforehand. So, a common complaint about Americans is that, wow, they seem to like politics and take it very seriously, but boy, they sure don't seem to vote very often. And the fact is that a lot of political scientists believe it's because they're asked to do so much. The only comparable country that's asked to vote as often as Americans are is, believe it or not, Switzerland. That's more related to their cantons and their very local issues they deal with. And they have the same problem with low turnout that America does. So that's an interesting thing. Not two countries you'd ever think of having anything in common politically. Okay. And lastly, I have already mentioned that. So so America has intra-party democracy is often more vibrant than even the inter type. And now lastly, this is my last one down the sentence. Okay, didn't do too bad. Still got half our time for discussion and questions. I'm happy about that. So little summary. So Westminster system here, the executive is chosen directly from the parliament. And when you win that control of that government, you're responsible. You're responsible for the legislation that comes out of it. You're responsible for how it's implemented, the cabinet, for everything. In America, you have distinct, separate power centers. They're both constitutional officers. They both have legitimate claims to power, and they're often of different parties. So imagine one party trying to pass legislation that a president from the other party will sign, and you can see also the ability to simply blame each other, to say, oh, well, it's their fault. It creates such a different system, and it also can create having a separate executive can create more. Usually, these systems are more unstable. Since the last 100 years have been heaps of constitutions have been written after the First World War, the Second World War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and nobody, well, I don't want to say nobody, but virtually nobody, none of the major countries has a presidential style system. They are inherently unstable because you have two bodies with each with their own power base, and one of them happens to control the military and the national police, and that is a dangerous mix. So in fact, much more common to have the Westminster system of the executive embedded with the parliament. Compulsory voting was something that I was surprised when I came here. I had not heard of that before. Of course, I take my politics very seriously, but I thought I was a little put on about that. I was like, well, hang on a second, you can't make me vote. What is that? But in fact, after I thought about it for a while, I am a huge fan of compulsory voting, because what it leads is compulsory voting, knowing that pretty much everyone's going to vote. We know there are some that don't, but pretty much everyone's going to vote, leads the major parties to appeal to the median voter in the middle. You're trying to get the 51st% voter over to you. So often both parties have very, transactional type policy that's trying to win over, people that are in the middle of politics. So it ends up for being to me, it makes for a sane, although to be honest, sometimes boring politics. Whereas American politics, you don't need to vote, and nobody cares. Nobody keeps track. So a lot of energy is put into getting your side excited. And I actually think this contributes to this sense of polarization in America, is that you're pumping it, and you're getting your side excited about what you're going to do, but people are finding it's easier to get you afraid of the other side. So negative partisanship, say, oh, who cares what we're doing? Those guys are really scary. You need to get that. So it creates such a the public discourse is so remarkably different without compulsory voting. And then we have a moderately well-funded public broadcaster that services, digital, TV, radio, and both parties feel obligated to appear on it. Even the coalition, which is not generally supportive of the ABC, even they need to their leaders need to go on to the public affairs programs of the ABC, at the 7:30 Report, Insiders, what have you, and that generates a lot of that actually generates a lot of the public discourse, even the stuff that gets picked up by the private sector, 7, 9, and 10, and the newspapers. That public broadcaster really adds some sameness to your public discourse. In America, it is largely immediate. It's a free-for-all driven by profits. And people have figured out that fear is way easier to get people to feel and to get motivated by than it is, say, hope or something better. And it's a dark place. People go down rabbit holes, and they really believe some real nonsense stuff. And our media has a lot to answer for that. And then I've already covered this. The proportional representation, at least in all of our upper houses, allows for, less common, less mainstream views to be heard and to be adopted. And often the mainstream parties will take good ideas that come from those. So it becomes sort of an idea generation, policy generation body that you really don't have in America. America is that you win or you lose, and there's nothing in between. So thank you for indulging me. I said 15 to 20. Looks like I win about 25. So I'm not happy about that, but still heaps of time. And I was hoping now to turn it over to the floor. And I have questions of my own that I hear a lot that I can start with, or I'm happy to take one from the floor.
Hi, I would like to know, first of all, why do you say that the US is is the oldest active constitution, isn't the UK?
Well, I'm using it. The UK Constitution is many, many parts to it. It's an informal constitution. So the Magna Carta certainly is older. That's considered the beginning of the modern UK Constitution at 1215. But elements have been built over centuries. And so it's not regarded as being a single constitution. So it's a splitting of a hairs. You notice I didn't say it's the oldest democracy or the oldest thing. It's just in terms of a complete intact constitution, still driving today's government, it is considered the oldest.
James, do you just want to stop sharing so you can see who's talking to you?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah, and the other one was, James, where does the Electoral College fit into all this?
Yes, I figured that would be. I think I had that as my first likely question. Now, let me stop sharing. Shirley, how do I stop share? How about pressing the red button that says stop? There we go. Sorry, that's the Electoral College is one of the most anachronistic and archaic elements of the U.S. political system. You would never in a million years make it today. It makes absolutely no sense. There are some practical and transactional reasons why it was. The idea that, as you saw in those elections that I held, basically the states conduct thousands of elections through every election cycle. And there's only one national election. So really, it's the states that are all driving where all the elections are. And at the time, so when they did it, having a national election with everyone voting in a country that would have ranged from the swamps of Georgia to the rocky shores of Maine, if you can picture that whole eastern seaboard of America, Florida wasn't part of the original 13. That is a massive area, and it would not have been terribly heavily populated. And imagine trying to hold a national election and counting everything across that in 1788. So the idea was, no, let's just count. Each state has their own election. You guys vote. You vote for the president, and then we add it all up. And then it's like, well, they wanted a way. This was a compromise they made with the slaveholders. The slaveholders, mostly in the southern southern half of the 13 colonies, wanted to be able to say, well, we want to be able to count our slaves. Now, we don't want them to vote, their property, right? But we need to be able to count them. And because, I'm trying to make this not too complicated, there's a horrible phrase in the Constitution, whereas in terms of representation, in terms of how many representatives you get in the House, there's a phrase in there that says, you get counted for each citizen, and then it says 3/5 of every other person. Without defining what every other person was, everyone knew what it was, and it was your slaves. And there was a way for the southern states to at least get 60% credit for their slaves, but without giving them any rights. And the Electoral College, by lumping everything together and saying each state gets as many you get as many votes for the president as you have representatives in the House, right? So a little state has 1, 2, or 3. California has 52. You get that many plus your 2 senators. Everyone gets +2. And it was this clunky, weird compromise. So it was a way to both avoid the trouble of a national election in a time when roads have been muddy and you've been going by horse buggy basically, and also a way for the slaveholding states to get a count of their slaves, at least, or getting 60% of them. It's part of America's very dark history. And again, not in a million years you have done this. The problem with the Electoral College is that if you win a state by 1 vote, you sweep that state. So that means there are so many people in states that are just largely ignored. So Trump supporters in California are ignored. Trump would have no reason to try to get his vote to go from 35 to 45 in California. He would get nothing for that, just as the Democrats would get nothing for increasing their vote in Texas. So it's such a bad system. And what it means is that the marginal states, right? So in a way that we do our marginal districts here with Eden Monero and all that every year, they're the same. It's the same, 10 or 12 that kind of determine who's going to control the prime ministership. It's these states, so really close states. So winning a state by 1 vote, you win all of that state, and it's such a foolish state, and that's why you have the marginal state. So forgive me, that was quite a long answer. Did that answer your question?
No. Sorry, I still don't understand where they fit into the actual voting system. I mean, you've got a lower house and an upper house and a judiciary. Where does the Electoral College is really important, isn't it? But I don't understand are they just voting for the president?
It's by the way, it's not an office that you hold or a job that you have. It is the Electoral College. Simply you take, let's say, however big your state is, you get that many the number you have in the House plus your 2 senators, so that you get, that's how many Electoral College votes you get. And they meet one day for every 4 years. And basically what you do is, so each candidate picks a slate of electors, says, okay, if we win, I'm going to send you 12 guys to go and vote. It's this weird formal thing they do that says, yes, you won the state. So I can't, again, I'm trying to explain something that makes 0 sense in today's modern sense.
So basically, so like Trump's going out saying, look, I'll do this and this for you if you give me your votes. So basically they're collecting votes. It's actually separate to the actual voting for a party thing.
No, it's actually not, forgive me, it's not separate. I guess maybe I should have taken a little more time to explain that. The Electoral College they are bound by what the state votes for. So if your state votes for that party, then those electors simply go and vote. They all their votes go. They're not meant to exercise their own judgment, or they're not meant to exercise their own choice. They merely are going there and saying, we came here to Washington as representatives from, I don't know, Delaware, and we represent, we are the 9 electoral votes that Donald Trump won. We're just pro forma marking them off and saying that they are. So they get no judgment. No one knows who they are. I mean, you could look it up. It must be somewhere, but they're not an independent body. It is this bizarre, rickety, archaic system that's a way of counting the state's votes toward president. And I can't make any more sense than that. I hope I've answered. I hope I did.
All right, we've got Adrian wanting to ask a question.
John, I've got 2 questions. How many swing states are in play this time around?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, I was surprised the Democrats didn't consider a female vice president nominee like Big Gretch. Or was that too dangerous? 2 males versus 2 females?
Excellent. Both excellent questions. First, the swing states seem to be, there seem to be about 7 in play. And there's sort of 3 across the upper Midwest, which includes the state I'm from. It's sort of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, right? And then you have what's the kind of then Sun Belt states. So you have some warmer states. You have, I think, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada. What else would be? There may be, yeah. But the play changed a lot when the Democrats switched from Biden to Harris. That really seemed to jiggle up the map quite a bit. And it does look, and these states, by the way, change over time. They are not fixed. There are times that states move between red, purple, and blue. And it's also a function of that. Look, polling is just really hard right now with people not answering phones. You're not having landlines. Not answering phones. I have real empathy for pollsters of trying to figure out what's in play. Yeah, well. Look, you can always tell too that the internal polling that the campaigns have. Where do the campaigns spend their time? And that's where they spend their time. They may go to the other states for fundraising. They go, Republicans go to Texas to get money, and Democrats go to California and New York. They're just going there to get money to run their campaign. So it'll come down to probably just those like 7 states. And then as far as doubling down, it's a fair question. There was some thought about that. But I would suspect a couple of things. One is that I suspect Governor Whitmer, who you mentioned, who's the governor of my home state of Michigan, she is considered a very good prospect for a future presidential candidacy. She's also young enough that she doesn't need to go this cycle. So I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if she pulled herself out of it to say, well, look, if Harris doesn't win, well, I'll be a front runner for 28. If she does win, well, I can still have a go in 32 when, if she served 2 terms. So her own personal ambition probably was probably a better gamble to go with to waiting. But what you hinted at, though, Adrian, before was about the risk. Is that you already have an historic candidacy. We have a woman of color at the top of the ticket. Look, risk management would tell you don't double down on that. That's a variable we don't know. So having something completely non-risky makes real sense on the back end. That's about the best I can say about that.
Okay.
Anybody else? Oh, Deirdre?
Yes. morning. President Biden said, I think 2 weeks ago, that he wants to bring in terms for the Supreme Court of 18 years, which for the record's too long anyway, instead of a job for life.
Yep.
Isn't that in the Constitution? Is that, or could he actually do that?
He couldn't himself, but you could do it with legislation that both houses pass and then the president signs. So no, the Constitution, while the Constitution embodies a thing called the Supreme Court, it actually doesn't have a great deal of detail. It doesn't even say how many justices there should be.
Oh.
So there is no, it allows it. The American Constitution, funny, it's actually, yes, it's the oldest in the world. It's actually one of the shortest as well. It's about 7,500 words, including the amendments, and there isn't a huge amount of detail in it, which is why so many governments are always taking each other to court. States are suing states are doing the federal government back and forth. There's administrative law is a massive thing in America because there's these 4 layers of government, and there isn't a lot of explicitness in the Constitution about where the rights start. Now, the problem with trying to reform the Supreme Court will be the other party is perfectly, Republicans are perfectly happy the way it is right now. They have young appointees on there that are going to be serving for a long time, so they will not be cooperative in any way. And that status quo bias I talked about, all those choke points where things can stop, either house or at the presidency or whatever, can stop that kind of reform. So it's very hard to get any kind of reform that provides any political advantage. The only time you get a reform is when both parties kind of agree, okay, that's a good one. Like the last big one was they lowered the vote, they had changes in the Constitution. They lowered the voting age from 21 to 18 in the early 70s. Both parties agreed to it. They did not object. They were happy to do it. That would never happen now, because back then young people didn't vote any differently than the rest of America. That wasn't an indication. What now? Young people overwhelmingly support Democrats, so that never would have passed now.
No.
Liz wanted to ask a question. You need to tap on your microphone, Liz, so we can see you, because I've got you on mute. And then Robin's next.
Hi, I want to know why and how can a man like Trump be president when he has got so many criminal charges against him?
Yep.
Why?
Right.
How come he's allowed to even be able to do that? He's in and out of court all the time, yet he can become president. I don't understand that.
Yeah, look, it is clearly, it is a flaw in the Constitution. They never occurred to them that they should have written down, yeah, you can't be president if you're a convicted felon. It's not written down anywhere. I'll tell you how strange it is, Liz. There's nothing stopping Trump. He could be the president from prison.
Whoa.
No stopping him. I mean, look, this would be like completely bonkers and crazy. But
this is what I can't understand. How come he can be in prison, but he can be a president? It doesn't make sense.
Well, of course, it doesn't make any sense. As I said, trying to make sense of this, of the core elements of the system it's going to drive you crazy. It didn't occur to them to include this. Now, there's nothing stopping, for example, today's current Congress from passing a law that says if you have conviction felonies or if you've done this or done that, you can't be the president. They could do that, but what the Republicans would refuse to cooperate. The margins are razor thin, and it would be really hard to do that. What you're saying makes absolute perfect sense. Now, it is worth noting in terms of what he's actually been convicted of. Those are state level charges. So he's not been convicted in a federal court. And because of their control of the Supreme Court, many of his federal cases have been dismissed. Now they're trying to reconstitute, the prosecutors are trying to get them restarted and move it up again. But he actually got a lot of those dismissed. So look, it is just a crazy time. I mean, I think you could ask the question of how could America elect a man like Trump just full stop, even regardless of the criminal crime that you're asking. But yeah, no, because it is not expressly forbidden, there's nothing stopping him from doing it.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
Robin. Was that it, Liz?
Yes.
Hi.
Thanks, love. Robin?
Hello, thanks for a very interesting talk. I just wondered if there's a push to clean up and modernise this electoral system. It seems very clunky and open to corruption. And is there a push to limit the donations like there is in Australia to parties?
Yes. the short answer to all of your questions collectively are yes. There are absolutely movements trying to get it. There are people, good government types, they're called, and they're often disparaged as goo-goos because they're sort of naive and they think, oh, we need to change the system and we just got money out of it, it would all go away. Like they're not, neither party has fully embraced what it is they're doing. Generally, though, the Democrats would be one more in favor of reform, particularly, boy, the money in politics is a real dark part of America. And the Supreme Court has ruled largely they regard political donations as a form of speech, and that to limit the amount of money that you can spend on it is to effectively limit speech. And look, that is a really cynical, dark interpretation that could evolve. In fact, the better path would probably be to get the Supreme Court to evolve and look at it differently. But yes, believe me, there are plenty of people who are completely aware of how all the words you use, clunky, awkward, open to corruption. In many ways, I often taught my students to say, if you actually want to know how policy is made in America, but look at who stands to make or lose money from that policy and see where they lubricate the system and where they target. And it is just appalling elements of the American system. Like the fact that every state has 2 senators, that means all those unpopulated states in the middle of the country that have just, 800,000 people, they get 2 senators. Whereas the 40 million people in California, they get 2 senators. So you'll find companies in America will go, well, I can't afford to buy a senator from California. There's too many people competing for that. I'll go buy a senator from Montana to get something stopped. And I mean, it's just appalling. And this is legal. This is not, but people recognize it. But look, so much of the party's benefit, so much of policy is made to America to support the well-to-do and high-end corporations. And I tell my students, if you follow the money, that is often how you will find a policy change occurs. If you allow me one little tiny story that is just shows that it can actually work in another way, in a good way, for example, the same-sex marriage movement started in America was largely kicked off by the bed and breakfast industries of Vermont and Hawaii, in that both Vermont and Hawaii, 2 states that nobody ever looks to for policy leadership or ever thinks of much, they both recognize that, wow, we get a lot of tourists from areas that have a lot of gay people in them. They're coming from New York, coming from the West Coast. So we're going to make up something that no one's ever heard of. We're going to make up civil unions. We're going to say, you can come to our state and you can have a civil union, but you come here, but you're going to need to stay in a bed and breakfast. You're going to need to stay in a resort. You're going to spend some money. And that simple movement about 20 years ago was the beginning that led to the juggernaut that eventually led to same-sex marriage. So in that case, that was just a small little niche business creating policy innovation because it wanted to make more money.
So different to us.
Yes.
What was that? Sorry?
Alan?
I said so different to our system.
Yes.
James, what is Project 2025 all about?
Yes, excellent question. There's a fairly prominent right of center think tank called the Heritage Foundation, which has actually moved further right during my lifetime. And what they sensed is that Trump got elected. Many of the votes that provided Trump's drive into the White House were provided by evangelical Christians. That is why he chose Mike Pence as his vice president. That was his card. That was his insurance. That was the insurance card to evangelicals to say, you will always have one of your own in the room because I picked Mike. So the Republican Party it does most of its policy for the big end of town, for corporate America, for the oligarchs that for the billionaires, but there aren't enough of them to provide the votes. They've always relied on religious conservatives to provide the majority of their votes. And this is why they fight this endless culture war stuff. Their actual policies aren't popular. So they have to do distraction to get people to get engaged and do that sort of thing. So what conservative Christians realized was, you know what? We didn't get enough out of that first Trump administration. They always give the tax cuts to the big end of town. They always get rid of corporate regulations, but they don't ever actually give us anything. So you know what? Trump is largely a vacuum. Ideologically, he's a vacuum. He wants to be president to stay out of prison and to get a cut of America as it's broken apart and sold for parts. And he actually doesn't have an ideological bone in his body. He doesn't actually care about that. But conservative Christians do. They believe that they are the rightful heirs to to America as a refuge for white European Christianity. They have very, very strange beliefs. And they decided, you know what? Trump is a vacuum. He doesn't actually have a lot of people that know what they're doing. He's really just a sort of gangster capitalism is what he really is, what he represents. So let's write everything down. Let's recruit everyone that we need. The president appoints about 8,000 people. So it was part of it was a recruitment drive. Part of it was stating all the policies they were going to do, all the changes they were going to make to the civil service system so that they could replace more of their people. And this whole thing was written, and they wrote it all out. And I tell you what, and Trump must just be absolutely furious because, of course, I don't know if you know this about Trump, but he doesn't like anyone writing down anything in meetings. He runs the government like a mob. He says, don't write stuff down. He must be furious that they wrote this down because they put it in black and white, all the nonsense that they wanted to do that most Americans actually do not agree with. And he must be furious. And that is why he is trying to backpedal at a rate of knots away from it, saying, no, it's not me. And the problem is that like 18 of the 25 people who wrote it work for him. All the training videos were done by his own press secretary, did training videos for it. Like his fingerprint, his administration's fingerprints, his potential administration's fingerprints are all over this thing. And he must be furious. Even the guy who read it, who heads up the Heritage Foundation and was the director of creating it, he had a book that was due to come out last month, and it was going to be election book. Political books still do very well in America. And J.D. Vance, his vice president nominee, wrote the foreword to it and said, what a terrific guy he is. And Project 25 is wonderful and it's going to be great. They told the publisher that they canceled publication of the book till after the election because they know how badly that will go. So Project 25 is a vision of Americans a vision of conservative Christian Americans trying to do something that's never been done before. Big government conservatism. The idea of, mainstream Republicans used to all be about, look, we have our private country clubs, we have our private schools, we have our private hospitals. Frankly, just don't tax us and leave us alone, and we'll use that status quo bias to make sure that nothing changes. Well, that is not how Christian conservatives see it. They want to use the government to impose their will on society. They want to roll back same-sex marriage. They want to get prayer in schools. They want to place Christianity in the center of the public square, not one religion amongst many as equals in the space of freedom of religion, but no, a first among equals, and you need to make it ours. And it is not have a long history of American governance, and it is not. I'm not surprised that the Democrats have been so successful, and it was so easy to hang that like an albatross around his neck.
Wow.
Was that too long of an answer? I think that was too long.
No, that was good. Alan, you want to say something else?
So what do you think of the chances of Trump getting in? I think it's still very tight.
Yeah. Say it again, sorry, Alan.
What do you think are chances of Trump getting in? Because I think it's at the moment it's very tight.
Yeah, look, I do. I would say right now, I'd say it's a coin toss. I mean, you wouldn't give me if you forced me to bet, I would probably put I think the Democrats. I think that the anti-Trump coalition is bigger than the pro-Trump coalition, and I think all the Democrats need to do is have a plausible leader in charge of that coalition. It doesn't need to be brilliant. I'm actually really glad. I don't believe Kamala Harris. She hasn't tried to do too much. She doesn't need to shake us out of our torpor and get us motivated and get us jazzed up. People who don't want Trump to be president are motivated and ready to go. I've referred to as Trump. Trump is the great motivator and uniter of the Democratic Party. Trump ended the Bernie versus Hillary wars, basically, right? You look at left-wing progressive members of Congress; they all have supported Biden and Harris. So, AOC and the ones that are famous, like the ones that are kind of well known. That has ended. Democrats are aligned and ready to go, and as long as she presents a plausible alternative, I believe they will get over the line. Because what Trump is selling is Well, it's a very dark vision he's selling. He's selling that America is in great decline and only I can save it. And it's a really hard argument to make, particularly when it's not true. America is not in a state of decline and isn't doing badly. And he's presenting this very, very dark image. And while I've been watching elections for a long time, generally if the side with the positive, optimistic story generally beats the one with the dark, negative story.
Thank you for that, James.
Sure,
Much
no worries.
appreciated.
Can I like to pose a question if I could? When is, I get that all the time. Why are American election campaigns so long? Right?
Yeah,
Right. Crazy long. And the reason, very simple answer, that there's only one election held, there's only one office voted for at the federal election, the president, right? Everything else is state, county, and city. And it's only done once every 4 years. And because it's an independent body, separate from the legislature, it is an independent constitutional officer with separate constitutional powers derived from their election, is that, sorry, I was winding up to a point there and it just slipped away from me for a second. There we go. Because of that, there is no such thing as the alternative president as a job. That's not a job. Whereas in a Westminster system, the alternative prime minister is a job. You actually have a job. You're the opposition leader, and now you have the whole cabinet. You have the alternate government is sitting there waiting for us to look at and say, oh, there they are. And they go, oh, here's a defense issue, or here's a foreign affairs issue. You even know who to go over to the opposition. Because of the separate presidential system, there is no waiting. There is no president in waiting. So therefore, the parties both times, if there's an open slot, which there isn't, so usually when incumbents are usually automatically renominated. So so most parties do this every 8 years. You might have an open position, and you basically have a bunch of very ambitious politicians, governors, senators, former vice presidents, who all wake up every morning, look themselves in the mirror, and they see a president there. And you need a means to have those ambitious people with political resources and support and money have a competition to see who will be the nominee for president. So there really is, it's the independence of the president that requires that long campaign. And I would also argue that when we say our campaigns here are 6 weeks, that's the official campaign. Parties are campaigning well beforehand, establishing policy, floating trial balloons. Parties often switch out leaders, a year ahead of election and so forth. So official campaign 6 weeks, but we know it's a lot longer. But nonetheless, America is crazy. It's those federal presidential campaigns are so crazy because there's no other means of picking a president amongst all the regional potentials across that continent-sized empire.
Okay, I think, Bob, were you going to ask a question? I just need to get you to take yourself off mute. Just tap on your screen and tap on the microphone.
Still going. Still mute.
Okay. Yes. Is that on?
Yes.
You're right.
Yeah. Jane, I just wondered what you think the effect of Kennedy withdrawing from the race, giving his allegiance to Trump.
Yes.
Do people take any notice of him?
I don't believe it will have any effect. A Robert Kennedy Jr. in an alternative universe where he didn't become the incredibly strange person that he is, that would be significant. If a respected scion of the Kennedy political dynasty, which mind you is getting a little long and old in the tooth, right? I mean, but it still has juice and people still recognize the name. If he were a respected and admired member of that clan, then wow, him switching over to a Republican, that actually would be news. But he's been what's beyond a black sheep? He's been completely rejected by his family. I think the Democrats dealt with this very well. Early this year, President Biden hosted 40 plus members of the extended Kennedy clan to endorse him and to reject Robert then independent bid. And so Robert has largely, so I would say the Kennedy dynasty is long in the tooth and doesn't have the juice it used to, and he is such an odd representative of it. And in fact, I believe that Kennedy was meant to be a third-party spoiler for Biden, because remember, Trump won in 2016 because he won with 46% of the vote because there were 2 or 3 third-party candidates that each got their 1 or 2%. Like there was enough people that were like that, so he was able to win with a minority of the vote or a plurality of the vote. Excuse me. He knows that his ceiling, Trump's got a ceiling of about 45 or 46. So he needs someone to pick up that 3 or 4 or 5 to keep him, to get him to win. And there was big Trump money was actually behind RFK Jr.'s campaign. I believe he thought he would be a spoiler and he would steal votes from Biden, particularly from maybe older people who might have a longer memory of the Kennedy dynasty in America. And in fact, I think the whole thing backfired because Kennedy is not driving on. There's no policy gap that he's filling that Democrats aren't happy about. There's no one in the Democratic world, in the Democratic coalition, who's anti-vax and anti-Semitic and his weird combination of beliefs. There's no one longing for that. He can't peel any votes off. In fact, their research showed that he was peeling more votes away from Trump. And so Trump's guys told him, turn off the spigot, stop giving him money and get him to endorse me. It was basically, to me, it was a political psyop that failed and backfired on the Republicans. That's how I see it.
No, thank you.
Thank you, James. Did anybody else have any last questions before we wind up?
We probably should have a follow-up after the election.
Yeah,
see.
I just thought of that.
We are going to have another session in October.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah. Or maybe one in middle of November too. I was in America when Trump came in the first time for on a fellowship, and like there were so many, and I was with the in military hospital, the large military hospital there. There were so many people that wanted to migrate to Australia because they just thought that was the end of research and the end of sort of reality for America. So it would be very interesting to see if it goes,
Which
the wrong way. Anyway,
Adrian,
thank you very much, James. That was great.
Yes, one more question, James. Sorry,
Yeah,
Adrian.
sure.
James, you've got part America, part Australia under your wing. What's
Yes.
the chances of Australia ever having federal elections on a fixed date every 4 years?
Yeah, well, the states are going that way, aren't they? Right? How many states have done it now? Right? Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales. Are they gone fixed?
Not sure.
Yeah. I think so. To me, that says to me that that's the direction it should be heading. And the mentioning of the 4 years, that would actually be. I would really like to see that. I think 3 years is actually too short to get much policy done and have a longer view. That's funny. Is there a movement around that to get that to change? Like, is it, I'm familiar with the Republican movement, that getting that change, but is there someone pushing for 4-year fixed? Is it, I just that kind of change would be best if both parties wanted it. If both parties wanted it, they could actually make it happen fairly quickly.
Well, I don't know that there's any great push for it, but the problem with the current system is that like the Premier can call an election because currently, their approval rating is up and they're never going to call it when their rating's down. But a 4-year fixed date takes all of that away.
Yes.
So, I agree. I would be very much in favor of that, to take that out of the picture, because you already have a lot of advantages as an incumbent, right? You have the power of the purse, right, to spend money in the marginal districts. You have the power of the megaphone of when the prime minister and the government makes announcements, we all pay attention. You already have so many advantages as an incumbent. To be able to time the election as well is really something. Although playing a little too clever can backfire on you. If was it Campbell Newman here in Queensland when he tried to call the first summer election in felt like about a century, and he thought, I'll be really clever and do it, and he went from having the biggest majority ever to getting swamped out in one term. So you can overuse that power too.
Well, that's all the questions for today. I'd like to say a very big thank you to James. Thank you so much for hosting today. Much appreciated. We appreciate your knowledge and your enthusiasm, and thank you for presenting.
That's great. Thank you, Shirley.
Thanks, James.
Thank you, Jane.
So
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
all coming in October,
Betcha.
and we might have to do the November one.
Great questions, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It
you.
was great.
Bye.